Lily Mason stood on the crowded curb beneath a sky that couldn't decide whether it would drizzle or weep. The city hummed in a low, indifferent chorus, brakes sighing, horns complaining, umbrellas muttering. Her coat, thin and stubborn against the November chill, clung damply to her shoulders like an unwanted promise. She fumbled with her phone, eyes skimming the screen, then the towering face of Meridian Ventures across the avenue. An interview that might tilt the axis of her life was scheduled for 9. The watch on her wrist read 8:27. To anyone else, the morning was ordinary. To Lily, it was all that separated her from something she'd been building for years out of night classes, thrift store textbooks, and second-shift paychecks. A black cab slowed by the curb, and a businessman in a pressed suit stepped in before she could. Lily exhaled, a sound that tasted like defeat. The rideshare app rotated its loading circle like a metronome of hope and then, mercilessly, timed out. The subway would be tight. No, ridiculous. She weighed options the way someone counts coins. Every second spent deciding was time subtracted from an interview she had rehearsed in the mirror until her reflection learned how to sound confident. A stumble on the sidewalk pulled her attention sideways. A man had toppled near a lamppost, his posture collapsed into something fragile. He clutched his chest. His suit, though clearly expensive, was soaked with a vulnerability money couldn't dry. Passers-by navigated around him like a river flowing past a rock, unwilling to divert their current for a moment. Lily's fingers tightened around her bag strap. If she helped, she would be late. If she left him, she would tell herself she was doing the pragmatic thing. Her pulse ran quick with the arithmetic of consequence. A faint groan changed the calculation. Something in Lily's spine uncoiled. She crouched without a conscious plan, hands on his wrist, breath shallow and suddenly loud in her ears. The man's eyes opened to hers, blue, distant, surprised to still be in the world. "Can you hear me?" she asked, more to anchor herself than him. He murmured something incoherent about leaving him be, but his fingers were slack and his forehead slick with sweat. She called 911, voices and movement sharpening around them as if the city had finally remembered it contained human life. The ambulance came like a punctuation mark, red and authoritative. Paramedics moving with the clean choreography of people who meet emergencies daily and keep their tempers out of the delivery. Lily watched them lift him gently onto a stretcher, felt relief that was immediately threaded with a different, hollow realization. Time had not been paused for kindness. Her watch blinked 8:56. She was supposed to be at Meridian in 4 minutes. She imagined the receptionist's cool face, the sterile handshake of dismissal she had rehearsed. Guilt ran through her like a second weather system. She had performed the morally right act and paid a steep, immediate toll. Pushing through Meridian's revolving doors took breath and a decision. Maybe both. The lobby was a cathedral of commerce, marble and chrome, and a chandelier that threw cold constellations onto polished floors. The receptionist glanced up, a neat eyebrow making a small, smug arch as she took Lily's drenched, earnest breath. "Name?" she asked, fingers already tapping. Lily said it before she could second-guess herself. "Lily Mason, executive assistant interview." The word interview hung between them like a fragile lantern. "You missed the slot," the receptionist said with the soft cruelty of someone who polices time for a living. Lily's teeth clenched. She explained, the collapse, the ambulance, the paradox of duty versus ambition. The woman looked at her with an expression that tried on sympathy and dismissed it. "Mr. Cole is strict about punctuality. We can't hold things." But then the receptionist reached for a phone, made a call that sounded like a small private rebellion, and after a clipped exchange, returned to Lily. "He'll see you. 10 minutes. Inside the interview room, the man who sat behind the glass was not the type Lily would have expected to be moved by a street-side rescue. Margaret Cole, head of human resources, was younger than Lily had imagined, efficient like a metronome set to corporate time. He listened, his eyes flitting to the window that showed the city, then back to Lily, as if weighing two different currencies, commitment and compassion. "If you were already here, with a deadline," he asked, voice casual, like a knife's edge, "and you chose to help a stranger instead of calling in, what happens?" Lily answered, as she always did, with truth and algebra. She'd help and then communicate, find solutions, cover the gap with a plan. He nodded, but the nod wasn't for her. It was for a ledger he kept of what could cost millions. The corporate world had built itself around the predictability of presence. Her moral act had an economic cost in someone else's calculus. The rejection felt less like a door closing and more like an entire floor of the building folding inward. She left Meridian with more than rain in her coat. The city felt colder, or perhaps it was just that disappointment had stripped the colors from the morning. She stood at the curb, phone still clutched in her hand, when an unknown number lit up her screen. The voice at the other end was quick and professional. "This is St. Augustine Hospital. The man you helped asked to see you." Lily's chest contracted and then expanded in the kind of breath you take when a path that seemed lost suddenly reappears as a glimmer. She could have gone home, soaked in the familiarity of small comfort. Instead, curiosity, and maybe the thin spark of moral curiosity that had made her stop in the first place, pulled her down the avenue toward whatever story the day still had left to give. The hallway at St. Augustine smelled of antiseptic and distant conversations. Lily's shoes clicked against tile, a metronome of nerves and possibility. Room 412 was down the hall. A nurse pointed the way without looking like this was an unusual request. The world outside was still a city moving on rails. It always would be, but inside those hospital walls, time slowed like syrup. She knocked softly before pushing open the door. He was there. Alexander Pierce, as she would learn later, though at first he was simply a man reconciling his own frailty. Removed from the armor of suits and boardrooms, he looked startlingly ordinary. Shirt sleeves rolled, hospital bracelet on his wrist, a tremor of vulnerability that made the expensive tailoring of Meridian Ventures feel like something from a different life. His hands, large and accustomed to grip and command, rested on the blanket. His eyes searched her face, curious, assessing, and ending somewhere like surprise. "You came," he said, voice even, not overly grateful but not ungrateful either. Lily sat in the chair he offered, the plastic frame whispering under her weight. Up close, he was younger than she had imagined, and more present in a way that unfamiliar suits rarely let themselves be. The hospital's quiet pressed at the edges of the conversation, making everything feel intimate by default. When she told him she'd missed an interview because she'd stayed until the ambulance arrived, he studied her like someone tracing the grain in a piece of wood. "Most people walk on," he observed after a beat. "Not many stop." There was no flattery in his voice, no staged gratitude, just recognition, the kind that lands and warms the center of you. They spoke then, in small, measured sentences that swelled into more honest confession by degrees. He asked where she worked, where she'd studied, what she wanted. Lily's answers were lean and precise. This was how she had learned to tell her story. Less theater, more map. Night classes, 2 jobs, 1 stubborn plan to build a life that didn't erode. Alexander listened like someone not just waiting to speak. He asked sharp questions, gently probing corners she hadn't intended to show anyone. There was a difference between pity and fascination in the way he regarded her choices, an interest in the architecture of her resolve rather than the cheap scaffolding of pity. After a while, he changed the subject with an ease that suggested familiarity with the art of steering conversations. "Have you eaten?" he asked, camera blind and oddly sincere. She blinked, surprised. He wanted to take her to dinner, later, when he'd been discharged. It sounded casual, but underneath it thrummed with a currency of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or gratitude crafted into an invitation. When the time came, Alexander kept his promise. The restaurant he chose was a quiet globe of light and hushed conversation tucked away from the city's usual clatter. Lily felt like a misplaced piece of furniture in a room furnished for a different class of person. White tablecloths, low lighting, a sense that every dish was a small performance. Yet, Alexander was at ease in that atmosphere. He folded himself into it the way someone folds into a role they've longed to try. He ordered without ceremony and spoke with the casual authority of someone whose work required swift decisions. Lily, unused to the spotlight that came with such attention, found herself watching him as much as listening. There was intelligence in his pauses, a habit of evaluating options that reminded her of spreadsheets turned into human conversations. He asked about her interview, what position she'd come for, what she'd hoped to accomplish. She told him about the small victories that had propelled her, landing a scholarship for a single semester, working overtime to save for rent, the nights she'd studied until the library closed. Mid-dinner, Alexander's voice dropped into something more personal. He told her, almost offhand, that he was part of Meridian Ventures. The name registered like an echo. This was the company whose glass facade had swallowed her morning hopes. Lily felt the room tilt just a degree. She had imagined all kinds of endings to the day, but the idea that the man she had laid a coat under on a rain-slicked sidewalk was tied to Meridian was a stitch in fate she hadn't expected. He didn't gloat, didn't let the title sit like armor. Instead, he listened to Lily's retelling of the morning with attention and a measure of admiration that felt real. There was a serious tone when he told her, "I want to offer you something. An opportunity, a trial, not a gift." His words were careful. "Prove you belong. Not because I owe you, but because you earn it." Lily's first impulse was to refuse. There is a peculiar autonomy that comes from fighting for yourself. You don't want to be given what you've sweated for. Alexander noticed the hesitancy and smirked, understanding without condescension. "Think of it as a challenge," he said. "Show me what you can do." It landed like a pebble into the pond of her resolve, sending ripples. Nervousness, yes, but also an ember of possibility. Leaving the restaurant, the cold air felt different, compressed with potential. The city's lights blinked like small constellations. Lily hugged her coat closer, aware that something had shifted in the geometry of her future. The man she had helped was not a stranger cast away by chance. He was someone who had the ability, practical and social, to open a door. That was terrifying in its own right. Opportunity always is, when it comes swaddled in someone else's power. Yet walking back to the subway, Lily found that the uncertain future felt less like an abyss and more like a blank ledger waiting for her first careful, determined entries. The next Monday, the Meridian Towers rose like a promise and a puzzle all at once. Lily's reflection in the revolving door warred with the woman she had been the week before. Worn, perhaps, but steadier around the edges. Margaret Cole, the receptionist, registered her name with a flicker of recognition now edged with rumors that traveled faster through corporate air than any memo. "Alexander is expecting you," she said, not unkindly, sliding a visitor badge across the desk like an unexpected coin. Alexander's office was a study in restraint, glass and dark wood, a skyline that made decisions look inevitable. He was there, hands in his pockets, watching the city as though it were a strategy unfolding. He turned when Lily entered, as if delighted she had chosen to walk in despite the coercive realities of class and status. "You're early," he noted. She corrected him, deliberately, and folded herself into a chair like a person about to take a test she'd studied for her entire adult life. He didn't hand her a job with the flourish of a patron. Instead, he laid out parameters with the meticulousness of a financier and the fairness of someone who believed that merit could be measured. 6 weeks, he said. A trial. You will be evaluated on results, not stories. He placed a folder on the desk, objective goals, deliverables, the kind of language that made fairness feel both clinical and possible. Lily took the folder like someone holding a map to a new city. If she could chart the coordinates with skill, the prize would be hers. Walking into her department for the first time was to step onto a stage where every whisper seemed amplified. The other interns, polished, pedigreed, their resumes hyperlinks to institutions Lily had only visited in pamphlets, eyed her like a foreign element introduced into a chemical solution. Some looked skeptical, others were curtly civil. Rumors, which are the social currency of large companies, had already painted her as the CEO's special case. It's a phrase designed to pollute merit with favoritism, to make every success smell like a purchased good. Lily decided early to respond with work. She arrived earlier than everyone else, left later, and took on tasks that had the tang of danger. Spreadsheets that needed finessing, projections left in messy drafts, presentations that required a clarity her colleagues assumed only pedigree could provide. She made herself small in ego and large in output. When an opportunity emerged to present on an upcoming client pitch, she volunteered. She knew the risks. Presentations are gatekeepers in corporate life, but she also knew that silence was a slow erasure. If she couldn't speak, she'd be invisible. The day of the pitch, the conference room smelled of coffee and human tension. Executives filtered in with the assurance of people who believed in their own infallibility. Lily presented with the kind of focused energy that turns adrenaline into tool. She spoke with numbers and narratives, a combination that made dry projections feel like a case with a pulse. The room grew quiet in that thin, both respectful and surprised hush. Alexander, who had been watching from the far end like a lighthouse scanning the horizon, smiled, a small, rare approval that felt like validation rather than charity. Recognition didn't remove the friction. Rumblings continued. "Did she really earn it?" a senior analyst whispered. "Is she the CEO's favorite?" another muttered. Lily had to learn quickly to let that chatter pass through like wind through thin curtains, to not let the noise into the rooms where her work was done. She had come to Meridian to build, not to be an object lesson. Yet there were moments Alexander's mentorship made the line between boss and person blur. He didn't give answers. He prodded thinking. He pushed for rigor, and then offered the quiet nod that meant, "You're capable of more than you realize." The professional closeness was a delicate dance. Lily navigated it with awareness. Admiration kept luminous but private, competence loud and visible. And always, she kept her goals in sight. 6 weeks was a contracted period. It was not a promise of eternity. Days folded into one another, and Lily began to see Meridian's machinery from the inside, the gears of decision and the frictions that flattened good ideas into accepted compromises. She learned that corporate decisions are often the arithmetic of risk and ego. She realized also that her own voice, when allied with preparation, could be disruptive in a constructive way. When she suggested restructuring part of a failing pitch to include performance-based milestones, the room froze, then deliberated, and then, against cautious odds, the client accepted. That victory was small and large. Small because it preserved a single deal, large because it announced Lily as an intellectual force, not a lucky interloper. When Alexander offered her a permanent role, it was not the relic of patronage, but the consequence of demonstrable value. He said, "I want you on my team." The simple sentence held practical and emotional risks. Proximity to power can provide access and pressure in equal measure. Lily accepted because she had fought for the right to be seen not as a charity case, but as someone who'd earned her place. Yet a shadow of complexity lingered. How to keep integrity in the face of intimacy? And how to define success when the prize is also wrapped in human consequences? The rhythm of work at Meridian became a drumbeat, predictable, insistent, and sometimes hypnotic. Lily found herself settling into hours that were longer than they once would have been, the glow of her laptop a constant small sun. Her role on Alexander's team demanded attention to detail and a capacity for rapid synthesis. He offered challenges the way others offered praise, sparingly and with the expectation of work. It was a mentorship that refused to coddle and rewarded curiosity. That very refusal, however, birthed a dangerous intimacy. Working so closely with someone of influence and intellect is like standing next to a bonfire on a still night. Warmth accumulates and soon becomes the only thing you notice. Small interactions, an approving nod after a report, a question asked with an interest that lingered longer than strictly professional, accrued weight. Lily learned to measure them but not to inflate them. Meridian's social ecosystem was ripe with gossip. Any misstep could be turned into a narrative weapon. Alexander himself was careful, almost maddeningly so. He maintained professional boundaries while allowing small windows of personal exchange. Sometimes, after the office emptied and the fluorescent lights hummed, he would look up from his laptop as if surprised by the quiet and say, "You should go home." Lily would glance at the clock, at the pile of deliverables, and then usually decide to stay. Half stubbornness, half the curious pull that a person of intensity can have. He would then, paradoxically, linger in doorway conversation as though the pause between them had become its own language. There were nights the tension felt like a tangible thing, an electrical hum in the air. It would flare in a shared laugh, a soft admonition, or when Alexander leaned forward in a meeting and asked Lily to elaborate. To an outsider, it might have looked like mentorship. To them, it started to feel like recognition that moved beyond the purely professional. Lily's feelings shifted, not with sudden fireworks, but like the tide, incremental, patient, then inevitable. The problem, of course, was that this tide flowed towards someone whose professional authority could redraw the map of her career in a heartbeat. Navigating that territory required a kind of moral cartography. Lily drew precise borders and tried to follow them. She refused to let compliments replace competency, and she insisted that success be measured by results and not by affection. Yet private moments sometimes slipped through, an exchange of small confidences when the office had emptied, his hand briefly brushing hers as they both reached for the same report. It was nothing and everything simultaneously, a punctuation mark that made the next sentence feel uncertain. Work tested them as much as companionship did. During a crisis when a major client threatened to pull funding, the office dissolved into controlled panic. The fallout would have sunk lesser companies. In the crisis's heat, a strategy Lily proposed, restructuring the deal with performance-linked milestones, became the pivot that saved the relationship. It was a professional success with personal consequences. Alexander acknowledged it in a way that felt intimate, a private smile across a conference room that burned hotter than any public commendation. Even with success, the social stakes rose. Rumors circulated, some cynical, others protective. Colleagues speculated about favoritism, some admired, some dismissed. Lily kept her focus outward, on deliverables, on the metrics, on the fact that competence would silence the loudest doubters. Alexander's praise, when it came, was sparse and therefore meaningful. He would say, sometimes in passing, "Well done," and the simplicity of those words made their texture rich. He also challenged her relentlessly, never easy praise, always pushing to an edge of capability she hadn't known she had. Outside the office, their conversations softened, less guarded, more human. They talked over the coffee about books and about the small, stubborn things that anchor people. Family dinners, childhood summers, a favorite street where a bakery still made bread the old way. Those details made them real to each other, which complicated things further. Intimacy was not only romance. It was also the accumulation of shared knowledge about the small architecture of a person. It made it harder to keep professional distance when the person across the desk knew the unique way you liked your coffee or how you said your mother's name. The turning point came quietly. Not in a single dramatic confession, but in a night where caution finally lost its foothold. The office was empty, the city outside a soft smear of lights, and the two of them found themselves lingering near each other's desks. "I can't keep pretending," Alexander said, the words sharp in their vulnerability. Lily, who had catalogued Prudence for years, felt the catalogue tumble. He came forward then, not as a boss, but as someone willing to be a person whose feelings had weight and consequence. She met him halfway, not recklessly but honestly, and in the quiet of the emptied office, something fragile and real took shape. They would, in time, learn how to hold a personal life that shared a professional sphere. Rules written in soft voice and practiced in public restraint. But for the moment, the private recognition that something deep and tender was growing between them felt like both risk and refuge. Love, in work's unlit corners, had a way of revealing both the best and most precarious parts of a person. Lily understood that if the relationship was to survive, it would need boundaries, clarity, and above all, a mutual commitment to merit. For now, in the hush of late nights and the glow of screens, they simply allowed themselves to be seen. The professional risks of their closeness became opportunely obvious when a high-stakes deal unraveled. A major client backed out, citing concerns that rippled through Meridian's financial forecasts like a stone across a quiet pond. The fallout could have meant layoffs, reputational damage, and a recalibration of trust across the firm. In the crisis, the hierarchy frayed into a messy collage of blame, fear, and frantic calculations. Lily, positioned at the nexus of operational detail and strategic thinking, felt pressure like a tightening rope. She proposed a radical solution: restructure the deal to include performance-linked milestones, shifting initial risk away from the client and aligning incentives. It was a hand to take at a table full of people who preferred the safety of traditional posture. When she presented her plan, her voice was steady and her logic precise. She marshaled data, anticipated counter-arguments, and illustrated the plan with casework that made it feel plausible. The room listened, and then debated, and then pivoted in her direction with a cautious assent that felt like a victory wrested from gravity. The rescue of the deal turned into a proof point. Analysts praised the ingenuity. A few grudgingly acknowledged that the idea had been good and well-timed. Alexander, who had watched the whole thing unfold, offered a rare and frank commendation. Not spectacle, but recognition. "You did well," he told her in the corridor, a sentence so stripped of flourish it shone. Yet even triumph couldn't untangle the knots of gossip. Some colleagues whispered that her proximity to power had done more than mentorship. They suggested it had cleared her path. Lily understood the narrative but rejected its premise. She had earned her place through labor, failures, and small, relentless wins. Trust, however, is a currency more fragile than competence. The closer she moved to the center of Meridian's decision-making, the louder the questions about fairness became. At a board-level discussion, a senior partner asked bluntly about the optics of Lily's rapid ascent. Alexander defended his decision with the language of results and performance, metrics, deliverables, outcomes. Yet defending a loved one in public is a complicated act. It invites more scrutiny than silence sometimes would have allowed. Outside the office, they set rules, explicit boundaries meant to protect both careers and hearts. They would be transparent with HR. They would refrain from public displays that blurred lines, and they would keep their conversations about personal life off email and off calendars. Margaret Cole, the HR director, monitored the situation with the competence of someone who had seen both successful and disastrous office romances. She issued guidelines and held frank conversations. Professional process became scaffolding for emotional ecology. Still, hearts don't always abide by policy. Late one night, after a day that had felt longer than a year, Alexander found Lily at her desk, exhausted and raw. He stood in the doorway and for a long moment said nothing. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said finally. And it wasn't just about safety. The office had an intimacy at night that made privacy feel both safer and more complicated. They spoke then in an honesty that cut through rituals and language about optics. He acknowledged his fear of losing her, of compromising her integrity by virtue of attachment. She, in turn, voiced her worry. How to measure success when your personal life is wrapped into a professional arena where any misstep could ripple into too many hands. Commitment, they decided, required action. They established more than rules. They built practices. Lily requested a formal evaluation framework, public and objective, the kind of sheet people could point to if accusation came. Alexander, for his part, recused himself from some decisions directly affecting Lily, creating buffer zones that reduced the appearance of favoritism. These actions were practical, but they were also symbolic. Love in a workplace might be tolerated, but love coupled with structural safeguards could be respected. As the months unfurled, Lily's competence continued to define her. She led projects, negotiated with clients, and produced results that were measurable and impactful. Her name began to stand on its own in the corridors and email chains. People referenced her work in boardrooms without the caveat of proximity. Still, social currents are not easily rewritten. Behind smiles and professional nods, there were always those who clung to a simpler narrative. Power begets favor. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling quarter, Lily received a surprising note from a junior analyst who'd watched her quietly. It wasn't about gossip, but gratitude. "You made it possible to learn," the message read, "not because of who you know, but because of what you do." Those words mattered in a way that rumor never could. They were small talismans for the kind of reputation she wanted, built, not gifted. The test of trust in their relationship, however, was not merely external. It lived in their private choices. When Alexander received an offer for a high-profile public role in another city, both of them faced practical and ethical questions. An offer promised wider influence, but it also threatened to complicate the life they'd been constructing together. They discussed the possibility with a rigor that merged the personal and the professional. Scenarios, contingencies, the logistics of relocations, and the emotional toll on families. Love without deliberation is a romance. Love with deliberation is a partnership poised to last. No simple moral resolved their complexities. They moved forward carefully, as two adults who loved but resisted letting that love become a carte blanche for advantage. Lily's story, at Meridian and beyond, remained rooted in the work she did when no one was watching. That, ultimately, was the ballast that kept both reputation and relationship stable through the storms that business and life regularly conjure. Even the most carefully constructed safeguards can fray under pressure. The months that followed were no idyll. They were tests braided together like a series of examinations. Lily and Alexander navigated legal compliance meetings, performance reviews, and the small, invasive questions that curiosity can mutate into when it lacks restraint. Rumors waxed and waned like weather. They learned to field them with humor and with the quiet dignity of people occupied with meaningful work. But something new emerged. External actors, competitors and pundits who read corporate romance as a weakness and leveraged it as a tool. An op-ed surfaced in a financial blog that suggested nepotism and cronyism were alive and well at Meridian. The piece cited anonymous sources and focused on optics more than evidence. For Lily, it landed like a bruise, visible, tender, and strangely embarrassing. Her competence had always been her shield. Now she had to defend it publicly. Meridian's board convened an inquiry not to shame but to ensure transparency. Margaret Cole led the process with a methodical calm that turned discomfort into procedure. Interviews, documents, boards. Lily volunteered documents and calendars, emails, and objectives. Alexander recused himself from deliberations, a public display of integrity designed to mollify skeptics and to protect the firm. It was grueling, a bureaucratic marathon that left them both emotionally drained, but it also crystallized something essential. Commitment demands accountability. In that crucible, Lily discovered a new language for strength. She spoke at a board meeting about deliverables, timelines, and measurable outcomes. She presented slides that traced her work in a forensic, almost tender way, not to defend affection, but to show hours and results and outcomes. Her presentation was not a plea for belief, but a ledger of labor, a record that could not easily be sentimentalized away. When the inquiry concluded, Meridian published a statement. No evidence of impropriety, processes had been respected, and measures were already in place to strengthen oversight. The exhale that followed was immense but not entirely cleansing. Scrutiny leaves a residue. People remember the storm more readily than the calm. Yet the inquiry also hardened Lily. She found that the public defense of her competence had given her the language and authority to ask for the things she needed. A seat at tables, a voice in strategy, recognition that was not conditional upon who she loved. Their private life, however, bore subtle costs. Intimacy in public forums always risks becoming a genre, a thing people reference like newsprint torn and reprinted. The couple learned to armor their domestic life with the same meticulousness they used for work. Rituals to mark boundary, no work talk at dinners twice a week. Transparency to reduce the space rumor feeds on, monthly check-ins with HR. And time set aside simply for ordinary pleasures that didn't have agendas attached. They celebrated small things. A quiet dinner at a neighborhood restaurant, an impromptu street performance they watched hand in hand, the pleasure of a coffee with no agenda, and they chose to invest further in community. Lily mentored interns. Alexander funded a program that offered scholarships to students from neighborhoods like the one Lily came from. Those gestures were practical repairs to the ruptures power can cause when it rests in unbalanced hands. The gestures were not only charitable, they were ethical acts that reoriented both of them towards service rather than advantage. When a friend of Lily's father was hospitalized in a distant town, Lily took time off to be there, an act that became a quiet declaration that her life was not to be sacrificed at the altar of career punditry. Alexander did not use that absence as leverage. Instead, he stepped in to cover responsibilities, a simple act that mattered more than policy memorandums. They learned that love, tested, required small acts of generosity and the grace to let each other be whole outside the sphere of work. As the seasons turned, Meridian stabilized. Clients returned, investors relaxed, and the company's quarterly numbers recovered with a resilience that quietly vindicated the decisions Lily and the leadership team had made during crisis. The scars of rumor remained like faint lines on skin. Visible, but not the whole story. For Lily, the ordeal clarified the kind of career she wanted. One where competence, responsibility, and the courage to act ethically formed the backbone of success. For Alexander, the trials reaffirmed a belief that influence must be paired with stewardship. Together, they learned a lesson that felt, in its way, like an old truth. The measure of a life lived in public is not how loudly one declares love, but how faithfully one keeps their commitments to work, to people, and to integrity. In that season, the intimacy between them did not vanish, nor did it consume them. It became a foundation, tested and reinforced, not because it survived rumor, but because it was chosen, deliberately, every day. A year after the rain-soaked morning that had rewritten Lily's life, Alexander invited her to Meridian's rooftop restaurant for dinner. The city sprawled beneath them in a constellation of noise and light. The table between them was intimate, candlelight softening the hard edges of glass and steel. It wasn't extravagance for show. It was the place where they had chosen, through small acts and steady commitment, to celebrate something more substantial, a shared life that had weathered storms. They talked easily, like two people who had learned to navigate both their public and private selves. Laughter came easily, spliced with the comfortable silences that signaled true companionship. Lily found herself tracing the rim of her wine glass, thinking of the months that had telescoped into a year. The tiny victories, the public trials, the quiet nights spent sorting priorities and boundaries. She had learned to value the texture of ordinary days as much as the pinnacles. Alexander stood up, sudden and small in his nerves, and reached into his jacket. The moment slowed into a cinematic pause. He opened a small velvet box, the kind of gesture that seemed impossibly old-fashioned in a modern city. The ring inside was simple and unshowy, elegant in the way things chosen with care tend to be. Lily's breath caught in a way that was not entirely surprise so much as the recognition that the person across from her had made a long, deliberate choice. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice both steady and raw. Steady because he had thought through the consequences, raw because he had let himself be vulnerable in public, in a place where their lives were known. Her answer rose from a place she had built with toil and hope, a life where partnership was a choice, made not out of convenience, but out of shared values. "Yes," she whispered. The word felt small and enormous at once. He slid the ring onto her finger, and for a moment, everything else receded. The boardroom dramas, the rumors, the skepticisms. What remained was the promise that two people could commit to building a life where love and work coexisted transparently, where success was not a solo climb, but a shared ascent. Their wedding, months later, was modest in scale but rich in presence. They invited friends, family, colleagues who had become allies through the seasons. Margaret Cole officiated in a private gesture that symbolized the integration of their public and private worlds, a nod to the institutional scaffolding that had supported their partnership. Speeches were given not to crown a fairy tale, but to honor the choices and the labor that had led them there. Mentorships nurtured, projects rescued, interns guided, scholarships funded. On the first morning after the wedding, Lily woke to the light of a city that had been, in many ways, both antagonist and ally. Alexander made coffee, and they sat by the window, speaking quietly about the future. Children, maybe, careers, definitely, and more public service, certainly. They spoke in plans and contingencies, the language of two adults who knew love is less about romantic abandon and more about steady accompaniment. They continued to steward Meridian with a blend of rigor and compassion. The scholarship program grew. Interns from neighborhoods like Lily's thrived, and the company culture shifted incrementally toward meritocracy that recognized potential regardless of pedigree. Lily's career continued to be defined by the excellence of her work and the ethical backbone she demanded of herself and inspired in others. Looking back, the rain that afternoon on Fifth Avenue no longer felt like a single moment of fate, but the starting point of a series of choices, each one small, each one subject to consequences. She could have stayed on the curb. She could have let the cab pass. She could have taken the subway. Instead, she lifted her coat and offered warmth. That choice, like all choices, did not predetermine her life, but it opened a path she walked with intention. Their story was not a tidy moral, but a composite, an ode to kindness, the rigor of work, and the courage to pursue justice in small everyday acts. It was a reminder that fortune, when it arrives, is best stewarded by hands that have learned to labor, to listen, and to love with responsibility. In the years that followed, Lily and Alexander's lives intertwined in ways that mattered beyond the personal. They taught a company how to be better, and a community how to hope. And on quiet evenings, when the city lights shimmered like promises and the world felt vast yet intimate, they would often sit together and remember how a single act of staying had led them through weather and rumor and relentless work to build something lasting.